Emilie O'Driscoll is a content creator on TikTok and Substack, where she creates content around the topic of Irish mythology, Irish history, and the Irish language, and how these influence the Irish psyche to this day. She studied language and psychology at UCC, so this intersection is particularly intriguing to her. Like many Irish people, Emilie did not grow up speaking the language outside of classes in school, nor was she taught our ancient mythological history. This, she feels, is a consequence of our educational system and societal mindset surrounding our native language and culture. Because of that, these are areas of interest she picked up on later in life and is still actively learning about. She is, however, delighted to see a resurgence of the Irish language and Irish culture on social media, in music, and cinema. She feels we are experiencing and living through a very special Irish resurgence zeitgeist, which she is absolutely delighted to play a small role in. You're so welcome to How to Be Irish, Emilie. I have been following you on TikTok for the past while, and I myself have become so much more interested in Irish mythology purely because of your content. So I'm so excited for you to share more of that with me and the listeners today. And I wanted to start off by asking you, how did you yourself become interested in it, and how did you start learning about it?
Yeah, it's something I've been kind of reflecting on in the lead up to this interview. And by the way, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I was really, really happy when you outreached. And I've been following your podcast as well, and it's going, from what I can see, really well. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So I think my interest, it's hard to trace back, but I do think the pandemic played a big role in it. So I think it was 2021. It really burnt out from working during the pandemic. I was working online. It was, quite kind of a strenuous time. And I took a kind of a solo trip down to Kerry, down to Kinmare actually. And I was perusing in this little bookshop, and I found two books actually. So I found one called Do Nothing, which is by an author, Celeste Headley. I don't know if you've heard
the name of it before, but I'm not sure what it's about.
It's an excellent book. It's about just really slowing down, and it's about how the Industrial Revolution kind of really led us into this kind of 5-day work week, the 39 hours, etc., and how before that we had a much more kind of natural way of working. And I know, because I listened to your podcast, your last one with Rob, I think it was, and you touched on the 4-day work week, and I was like, yeah, this is great stuff. So I picked up that book, but I also picked up, and it's actually behind me, a book called Old Ways, Old Secrets, which is written by Joe Kerrigan, and it's about I suppose Irish mythology and ancient Irish history, and those are really kind of one and the same thing, I suppose. I have also always had a real interest in storytelling and language as well. I studied German actually, so German is my second language if you don't count Irish, which that's, I think, another topic that maybe we should all be counting Irish, even if we only have the cúpla focal, right? So I've always had an interest in language as well, and I think particularly in Ireland, the language, the mythology, and the history are all really incredibly interlinked. So I had that kind of interest there as well. And then I think, to give credit where credit's due, NECAP has really, and I know you touched on that in your last episode as well. I was really thinking, wow, that's synchronistic, but I think that speaks to the fact that we're all kind of thinking it. I think there's been a real resurgence of Irish, in no small part thanks to NECAP, but then also, thanks to social media as well, and people. I've come across so much on TikTok that is through the Irish language, and I absolutely love it. So a bit of a convoluted answer, I think, but hard one to pin down.
Yeah. I see where you're coming from. You're talking about, I suppose, the need to slow down and reflecting on perhaps some of the lessons from our ancestors. And I'm wondering, what kinds of lessons do you think we should be taking from our ancestors, particularly as Irish people? What are some maybe cultures or habits that we maybe have left behind, or perhaps are poking up their head again in this
Yes.
resurgence that we're talking about?
Yeah. I think there's there's so many ways to answer that question. If we go back to, say, the Celts, which would be kind of a newfound area of interest for me, they would have had druids, right? So like these very kind of mystical, I suppose, people, but also extremely well educated people. So they were almost sorcerers, but they were also lawyers and they were historians. And I think what we can really learn from them, and just from our ancient Irish history in general, is this deep relationship with the land,
Mm-hmm.
and a deep respect for nature. So they had kind of deep associations with the trees, animals, rivers, and yes, there's that kind of mythological sorcery type element to it. But I think that's something that we can definitely look to today as well. A really interesting thing that I found out only recently about Irish Druids is there were Druids in various different cultures across Europe. Um, Irish Druids, very specifically in their spell casting, etc., were very respectful of nature. They never injured animals in order to predict the future and this kind of thing. It was always They were always very conscious of the natural world, and kind of doing no harm. So I think that's definitely one thing we can take. Another thing, and this is something that I think is really interlinked with our kind of ancient Celtic and pagan past,
Mm-hmm.
is its relationship to Christianity and Christianity in Ireland. Um, I think for a myriad of different reasons, a lot of Irish people, particularly younger Irish people, have started to move away from their association with Christianity and Catholicism. I don't know how you feel about that yourself, or would you be religious yourself?
No, and I think I totally agree with you on that. Like I'm always thinking about, in a sense, like the new religion is almost like, the star signs and the horoscopes and the astrology
Mm-hmm.
and all of that. And I wanted to ask you
Yeah.
about the Celts, or like other ancient people in Ireland. I think you mentioned in one of your videos
Mm.
about how there was like astrological
Yeah.
symbols in
Mm-hmm.
Newgrange, and I was wondering, I was like, okay, were the Celts, did they have star signs? Like, what was going on there?
Oh, I actually don't know if they had star signs.
Hmm.
I would love to look into that a little bit more. Um, but yes, they did have a very advanced understanding of the skies, what we would kind of call astronomy and or astrology now. And just to clarify as well, actually, so I know what you're talking about, that Newgrange video. The Celts would have been similar, but then Newgrange, I suppose, was kind of pre-Celts.
Hmm.
So they would have been pagan people as well. But sites like Newgrange, you're looking at that particular site is like 5,200 years old, I think. Like, it was built before the invention of the wheel. It was built before, the pyramids of Egypt. It's an incredible site. Um, and yeah, Newgrange is a particularly fascinating one to me, because I think it speaks to, this was an extremely important monument for these people, and it speaks to, it's undeniable that there was a spirituality there. So it was, Newgrange was a burial chamber, um, but a lot of the stones would have been extremely heavy. Like, a lot of them were weighed multiple tons. And if you think about, like, how did these people transport those stones? Some of them were, they've tested them. Some of them were from tens of miles away, and you think, without even the invention of the wheel, that they're getting these stones to this monument, which again just kind of points to how sacred that monument was. Um, the other really interesting thing I think about Newgrange, and again, it's maybe a little bit kind of spiritual, maybe a little bit woo woo, but it's fun to think about, is the Celts. The Celts used the Newgrange site as well. So this is like thousands of years later. And very likely the site would have been covered. So they wouldn't have known that there was this prehistoric burial chamber there. And yet there was a draw to that site, right? So the Tuatha Dé Danann then, which would be, they would be almost like Celtic mythology. They're said to live in burial chambers like this. So the Celts would have said they lived in that mound in the Shee, the hill, and it has ties to places like Tirnanog, so the other world.
Just for people who don't know, what is kind of almost the timeline of people in Ireland if we were to kind of break them up into their different groups, and then maybe the mythology that we might associate with each of those groups? Because I'm thinking of Tirnanog, Children of Lair, like those little books you used to have. And I think there's a lot of confusion between maybe what is mythology and what is real. So I'm wondering if you could like help me understand like who comes when and who's associated with what.
Yeah. If I answer kind of your second question first, I think the confusion around what's mythology and what's real, it actually makes a lot of sense. Because a lot of our mythology, it's kind of linked in with our history. Like mythology was a way for us to tell our history. So there's, and Joe Kerrigan talks about it a fair bit in Old Ways, Old Secrets. There's a kernel of truth very likely to a lot of our mythology. But yeah, to give you an idea, and I suppose to give you my understanding of it so far as well, because I am still definitely learning about all of this. So we would have had the Leabhar Gavála, first of all, that directly translates into the Book of Invasion. So you're right, there were plenty of invading people that came into Ireland. So we had kind of an indigenous people, so we think they died out. Then we had the Nemedians. And again, this is kind of inextricably linked with myth. It's hard to kind of separate it out. So we had the Nemedians, who they left the country because of the Fomorians. And the Fomorians, I suppose we don't know if these were a kind of historical people or if they might have represented, like bad weather and like treacherous kind of land and all of this kind of thing. But they're kind of painted in a mythological sense as like almost a monstrous kind of people. There's in that group, for example, there's Balor the Evil Eye, so he would be kind of similar to a Greek Medusa. So he need only look at you and kill you rather than turn you to stone. So you'd these Fomorians who are kind of the baddies of Irish mythology, and they ran the Nemedians out of the country. And then what happened was kind of two, I guess, like fractions of the Nemedians returned to Ireland. So it kind of goes. So you had the Furbolg, which literally that translates as bagmen. And the reason we think they were called bagmen is because they carried fertile soil in bags. They came back to Ireland from Greece. And then you had the Tuatha Dé Danann, who are mythological. They're Celtic mythology. Although I suppose, some would argue that they're not, and they're our gods, right? So again, quite tricky to kind of like separate that out. So the Tuatha Dé Danann came over, and they came over on like clouds of mist into the country. And the interesting point, if you go kind of out west, out to the old country, there are still people generally of an older generation that will say the Druids are passing. When there's misty weather, when there's fog, they'll say the Druids are passing, and it's related to the Tuatha Dé Danann because they had Druids who could control the weather. So that was the Tuatha Dé Danann. And then they fought the Furbolg, and they also fought the Fomorians. They got the Fomorians out of the country. Everyone's delighted. And then the Celts come along. So the Celts in mythology are called Milesians, I think is how it's pronounced. they, in mythology then, fought the Tuatha Dé Danann. The Tuatha Dé Danann lost, but didn't want to leave the country, so they retreated into the hills, into the trees, and into our mounds and our kind of burial chambers, and then of course to places like Tir na Nog, which is where a lot of us would know them from. The Tuatha Dé Danann as well, which I didn't kind of realise until recently, are very much one and the same as the Os She, so our fairies, and like Irish fairy folklore is a very strong folklore as well, right? We've got all that mythology about changelings, fairy forts, etc. And even to this day, I don't know if you remember, there was a road being built somewhere, and it wasn't built in that direction because it was going to pass, was it through a tree or a fort? But anyway, it was denied.
Yeah.
I suppose that kind of brings us up to the Celts. Then you do also have other invasions like the Vikings, which we would have kind of learned about in school. After the Celts, I think one of the most important kind of influences would have been the early Christians. And that's where you start to see a bit of a turn in Ireland from paganism into Christianity. And that's, I think, really fascinating as well, because just to clarify, I studied German and psychology in college, but it was an arts degree. So in my first year, I did religion. I'm not religious myself, but I think it's really fascinating, as I think it kind of speaks to a want that a lot of people have to kind of explain and connect, etc. But the early Christian monks in Ireland are a really interesting case of Christianity, because what they did is they incorporated Christianity actually relatively peacefully into the country. And the way that they did that was they took all of these pagan beliefs and they effectively said to the people, you can keep these, you can have your secret wells, you can have your deities and your Tuatha Dé Danann, but it's Christian now. And that's where you get this really interesting transition of, say, Tuatha Dé Danann gods who have become Christian saints, kind of specific to Ireland.
Wow.
Yeah, so you've got, say, for example, Bridget. She would be a really good example. So she's kind of almost threefold. So she was a goddess of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and then she was also a Celtic druid as well, a very powerful Celtic druid. And then, of course, we have St. Bridget. And St. Bridget's church was built on the grounds where the druid St. Bridget would have practiced as well. So I think that connection is also really fascinating. The other thing, look, I think we're kind of rightly moving away from Catholicism, right? And Catholicism did a lot of damage to Ireland and to women as well, right? But one really interesting thing about early Christianity in Ireland is that it preserved our Celtic mythology and our Celtic history. So the Celts would have had an oral tradition. They used ogham writing, if you've ever seen that kind of linear writing. Yeah, but that was more so, that was almost like Morse code. That was a kind of a secret language, basically, between themselves. But what the early Christian monks did was they wrote down these stories that we had orally, and actually ended up preserving them. So we have effectively the best preserved Celtic mythology in Europe, and it's thanks to those early Christian monks. So
Wow.
yeah, so I'm very much in two minds about Christianity and you know what it's done and how it's influenced the country, but I do think we've them to thank for that at the very least.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. I had no idea that St. Bridget had like almost developed from pre-Christian times, and she like her story was carried on through. I think it's so positive to hear that the early Christians in Ireland wanted to preserve the traditions and that they put those stories down into words. You know, I suppose if the Druids were writing ogham, then, you know, that was maybe the only way that they were going to be able to keep that, if it were not only through storytelling. So that's so powerful and amazing. I had no idea about that. I'm really curious to ask you about Samhain, or like Iha Hauna, Halloween, because this episode is going out around that time, and it's a very, very, very important time in paganism And I'm also curious about how that ties into other times in Ireland, maybe how it developed over the course of time, and then also now as it exists today. But I think people
Yeah.
are really like excited about Samhain, and they are so
Yeah.
much more knowledgeable about what it represented. It's so cool. So could you give us maybe a little bit of an overview on why Samhain is so important?
Yeah, so oh my God, and I'm kind of gearing up to do like a lot of these videos as well, because it's spooky season, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's and Samhain is really fascinating. So Samhain, I suppose to give a general overview, you've got kind of four phases of the Celtic year. So you have Samhain, Imbolg, Bealtaine, and Lunasa. And Samhain and Bealtaine would be two of our kind of quote unquote main festivals. Bealtaine is a really interesting one as well. That falls around May. You're probably well aware. But Samhain is really cool. So Samhain, as you probably know as a Gaeilge, it means November. And the reason that it means November but happens on the 31st of October is because the Celts saw the transition of a day. So from daylight turning into night, they saw that transition as the new day. So that's how they marked the new day. So that piece kind of makes sense. Samhain is effectively gave way to Halloween as we know it. So, and this idea that the veil between our world and the other world, our world and Tír na nÓg, our world and the world of the fairies, the Tuatha Dé Danann, the Pukas, the Banshees, etc., was thinnest at certain times of the year, and these were transitional times. So Samhain marked the transition from the harvesting part of the year into the dark months. And then Bealtaine, like I mentioned, because that's another one that's really important, marked the transition into the summer months. So Samhain, the veil between both of the worlds were kind of weakest at this point. There was the idea that the Oss-She, the Tuatha Dé Danann, all of these kind of creatures, and also the dead, could pass into our world at that time. One of the reasons that we dress up for Halloween, that we dress up as kind of scary things for Halloween, is because we were blending in with these otherworldly creatures. So it was in a sense to kind of not be detected by them, which I think is really fun. But another kind of element of that is we like to think about fairies in the modern sense as being, playful and being tricksters and all of this. They could actually be quite ominous, like in Irish folklore. Like they weren't to be messed with. So there are neo-pagans today who would kind of invite these experiences and would love to say meet someone from the other world. But actually our elders and our ancestors would probably warn us against doing that, right? So that's one thing. Another element of it then as well is that trick-or-treating, that even though that seems like a very American kind of tradition, that comes back to Samhain as well. So if you imagine, this would have been a time when we had finished up with the harvesting season and we were going into cold, dark months. We wouldn't have had the local Tesco or whatever. We had to stockpile for the dark months. Poorer people in the community would go from home to home asking for food, and that's where this idea of trick-or-treating came from. Another interesting tidbit that I heard recently, and it was on the podcast Candlelit Tales, which is a really good podcast for Irish mythology. Just a tidbit I heard there is that during Bealtaine, it was actually really bad luck to ask for anything. So during Bealtaine, if you were to ask for something, the person would have to give it to you, which you probably know as an Irish person. If someone asks you for something, like, we don't say no. You don't say no. Exactly. The person would kind of have to give it to you. So you weren't really supposed to ask, because it was bad luck, and it was seen as if you were taking something from that person, you were taking their luck. So that's a kind of a stark difference between those those two holidays.
What I think I find most interesting about Halloween is how much of it is still completely exactly the same today.
Yeah.
Like there's still trick or treating, the
Mhm.
fact that they still like scoop out pumpkins and put lights in them, the fact that we still
Yes.
dress up. You know, it's just like mad to think about it. Obviously it's so commercialized
Totally.
now, but like I think it's important to reflect back to like where it actually came from and go, okay, it is commercialized,
Yeah.
but we can still celebrate this. And it's, you know, it's we're honoring our ancestors and our tradition and cultures,
Completely.
which is an amazing thing and very exciting now. It's just around the corner.
Yes.
You talked about early Christian people and early Christianity. So I suppose that's kind of like personified by St. Patrick and him like banning the snakes out of Ireland and all that kind of stuff. And I believe that has some
Yes.
kind of a connotation or something. I
Yeah.
might ask you about that
Yeah.
in a second. But I'm curious what your thoughts are if St. Patrick did come and never banished the snakes out of Ireland. What do you think Ireland would look like today if we had continued with this like pagan traditions, Celtic traditions?
It really makes you think about it, doesn't it? Like I mentioned earlier, like we do have the Christian monks to thank for having a very well recorded Celtic mythology. You do think, okay, well, if the Christian monks hadn't come, like would that have been a natural progression anyway? Like would we have started documenting without the interference, right?
Yep.
It is really fascinating to think about. We had pre-Christianity, we had some fairly solid systems of law in Ireland called the Breen Laws. I don't know if you've probably heard of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So these now I have a book here, Breen Laws. It's by Jo Kerrigan as well. She's brilliant. And I haven't kind of fully gotten into it just yet. It'll maybe be next up on the book club. We had a system of law in Ireland that a lot of mainland Europe could only have dreamed of. We had a very well structured system of law, and women actually within that system of law were fairly well represented. There were definitely fairly strict kind of gender norms, like women would have had a lot of power, say, regarding their family and fertility. So it was quite gendered, but women could own property, and you know, women could divorce as well. I mean, they'd need reason to, but they could. And I think those are things that Christianity and then Catholicism took from Ireland, right? Like we became, I think, arguably a very, very oppressive society, particularly for women, but for a lot of people, really. But then it's such an interesting question, because the other side of it is that Catholicism in later years, when the English came over, it also came to represent us, and it became very much interlinked with our fight against our colonizers, you know, the English. I think you just have to, with Christianity in Ireland, with Catholicism in Ireland, you just have to sit with that kind of cognitive dissonance of, yes, okay, this was great, and the Catholic Church actually did a lot of good for the Irish language as well, because it became so intertwined with the Irish struggle and what it meant to be Irish, you know, in contrast to the kind of the English colonizer, who was predominantly seen as Protestant.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. Like, I mean, we do always think about Irish and Catholic, and we're kind of like, we're culturally Catholic. But then, of course, we've got so much history which is pagan and that we still see some of today. When you think about it in the contrast to our colonizers, the British, and how we used Catholicism, something that can be viewed as a negative, to almost like reinforce our own culture and our own selves. And it made me think about something else that you mentioned again in one of your videos. You were talking about us using, or more Irish diaspora using, the fact that they are Celtic to allow themselves to feel like they were able to be different and stand out from other people. And I think something else that you were talking about in one of your videos was the idea of like Celtic people weren't viewed as white, and that Irish people are only really been viewed as white in very recent history.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear more about that and how that came about.
I think that's absolutely fascinating because you take, I'm even like, I'm looking at myself, right? I'm like pasty white. I think, you know, you look at Irish people and you think, well, of course, white, like the whitest of white. As we know, logically, like race is a construct, and it's a construct of supremacy. Last year, I watched an excellent documentary called Tomb Raider with Ardal O'Hanlon.
From Father Ted.
Father Dougal, exactly. It kind of touched on that. So basically, when Ireland gained its independence from the UK, actually, I'll go back a little bit. So before that, I think one interesting thing for us to know and be aware of is the propaganda that the English used against the Irish was not at all dissimilar from the propaganda that enslavers in America used against Black people in America. It was very much, it was animalistic imagery, and it had that, I mean, what that effectively does is it others a group of people, right? So first of all, the kind of propaganda that was used against the Irish was very similar to the propaganda used against other oppressed people. So that's one thing. When we gained our independence from England, we had kind of an interesting dilemma, I suppose, which was the fact that we, like the English were here for over 700 years, I think it was, right?
Mm-hmm.
They had their impact. They had a massive cultural impact. So we were at a point in our history where we needed to kind of separate our identity from them. And one of the ways we did that was actually archaeology. So when we got our independence, archaeology had just started to take hold in Ireland. And we had an archaeologist called Adolf Marr. And it's unfortunately like not a coincidence that he shares his name with Adolf Hitler. And he was a Nazi. But something he did was he looked at our oftentimes burial chambers, Neolithic burial chambers, and he painted a picture of Ireland as a Celtic country. And that made us different from the UK, who they wouldn't have Celtic heritage, but it would be, I think, more so Norman, Viking, etc. So he was kind of separating us out in that sense and telling the world, look, the Irish are different. Actually, they're not like the UK. But what he also did was he said, you know what they also are is they're white. They're Celtic. They're not Normans, they're not Germanic, but they are white. And then that idea was exported over to the States as well, where, you know, we take the piss out of the Irish diaspora in the States, but like a lot of them are over there under horrendous conditions, you know, fleeing the famine for one, right? But this idea was exported over to the States, where Irish people had historically a really hard time as immigrants in the States. You know, you hear that saying, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. That was in the UK, that was in the States. And yeah, effectively the Irish diaspora were able to point to this kind of Celtic identity and say, I'm not like you. I'm not like, you know, a Black American. I'm not like, even at the time, an Italian American. I'm Celtic and I'm white. And there's a great book, it's called How the Irish Became White, which kind of touches on all of that as well. There was an element of newly white Irish Americans, the bullied, becoming the bully, which is, I mean, it's just awful to think about, really. Like, one other thing, and I'll come back to it, is I don't know if you remember during the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement in the States, but then obviously across the world, there was that famous image of someone supporting the police with duine gorm written on them. So they were supporting the police, this Blue Lives Matter kind of thing, using Irish. And I remember just being absolutely appalled that someone would use their Irish heritage to oppress another people. It's so, I think, so quintessentially un-Irish. And then I think, of course, the irony of it is that I think the word has changed now, right? But duine gorm used to mean Black person in Gaeilge, right?
Yeah, and I think it
So,
actually comes from the fact that I think I heard Emma DeBerry talking about this. Do you
oh,
know
she's
that writer?
brilliant.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
She was talking about the origin of the word, and she said they're not
Yeah.
100% sure where it comes from, but there's some
It's the
ideas that
hue.
like, yeah, it's to do with like the
Yeah.
way that light hits like black
Yeah.
skin, that it almost
Yes.
like the shimmer of blue or something, and I think that's where it
Yes.
came from, which I
Yeah.
think is like a really beautiful way to describe
hmm
it, you know,
It's,
like it's how the
yeah.
light interacts with it, you know, and that's
It's,
what color is, right? I think also as well because traditionally Irish people in the States have often ended up in careers in the police or in other like kind of governmental jobs or like careers with authority or whatever.
yes.
So it's kind of tied into that where it's like oftentimes Irish people and the Irish diaspora is thought of like kind of almost angelic, like, you know,
Mm.
we're not racist, we were colonized,
hmm
we have been oppressed, we understand, you know, the famine
Yeah.
was like absolutely horrific.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like those things are true, but what can be true at the same time is that
Mm.
because Irish people gain this status of being white, that there
Yeah.
are unfortunately people who took that to the wrong side and decided to use it in order
Yeah.
to become the oppressed became the oppressor. And that's
Yeah.
definitely been seen in the States, like that example that you gave there.
I think it's really important because you've touched on something so crucial there. It's really important. Like it's one thing to say, oh, the Irish diaspora did this, and you know that's that. Like Irish people as well are capable of racism, and I think like we've seen an uptick in that recently, right? And I think you can look to our history and you can do two different things with it. You can either empathize with other oppressed people like we do with Palestine or Native Americans. We have a kind of a historical link with them as well.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can weaponize it and you can, like you've kind of touched on there, you can say, well, I was oppressed. I pulled myself up by the bootstraps even though my ancestors were severely oppressed. If you can't do that, there must be something wrong with you. You can
Mm-hmm.
weaponize that, but I think it's really crucial for us it to be very cognizant of it, I suppose.
Absolutely, to be mindful
Yeah.
of it and to like not always paint Irish people in this fabulous, wonderful, sure, aren't we
Mm,
great light. Everybody
mm-hmm.
absolutely loves us. There's
Yeah. Yeah.
nuances to these things, and we
Yes.
need to consider all of the
Completely.
facts. I'm curious because you've studied language as well. And I know I asked you about what's the idea of Ireland if without Christianity or
Mm.
without Catholicism. I'm wondering, what do you think Ireland would be if the Irish language was never oppressed, and if the way
Oh,
that it has like been tied into, like, I know the way that you describe like Irish mythology and the way that the language is used to illustrate these things,
mm,
it just brings so much more life to it than like no other language is able
no,
to do it, because obviously
no,
this
it's
was the
beautiful.
language it was created
Yeah.
in, you know.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, like, what are your thoughts on the Brits never came over and
Mm.
forced us to speak English? Where would Irish be today?
I have so many thoughts on this. I think when the Brits did come over, like they obviously they oppressed the language. We weren't allowed to speak it. We were killed for speaking it. To call a spade a spade, it was obviously severely oppressed. Something that happens with colonization is that it lives on. I almost view it as it's almost like an abusive relationship. This person's gaslighting you. They're out of the picture, but we carry on that story. And the story we've carried on about Irish is that if you speak Irish and you don't speak English well, you're uneducated. It's associated with being poor. It is associated with not being a language of the world. And I think to one degree or another, a lot of us have a degree of gratefulness that our first language is English because we don't kind of quote unquote need to learn a second language, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But I suppose to that I would say, and to go back to your question of what do I think it would have been like if that had never happened, we could have been a very, very different country. For one, we probably wouldn't have had the consequences of the famine without the British, because of course it wasn't just that the potato crop failed, it was the
Yeah.
fact that food was being transported out of this country
Mm-hmm.
and the only thing we were allowed to eat was the potato. So first of all, our population, it was comparable to somewhere like England at the time. So had they not colonized us, Irish could well be just another world language. We could be very well set up. So I used to think myself, God, isn't it handy that really like I don't have to learn another language because I have English. But places like France and Germany, they learn a second language and it's actually really good for you.
Yeah.
And I say that as well as someone with dyslexia. So like I remember I went on to study German in college. One of the support staff in the disability centre said to me, why are you studying a language if you have dyslexia? I was like, I find it fine. And it's so logical. But like the mad thing I find about having another language, and I don't know if you feel similarly with Irish, it allows you to think in a different way.
Totally
That
agree. Yeah.
it's so it allows you to think in a different way, and then it allows you to almost like transport that into the other language. You can kind of cross pollinate almost. Like I find when I'm speaking German, I can be very assertive. And that's something as an Irish person, and we kind of touched on it earlier, that I really struggled with. So that was something I was able to, and that's only one example, like, but that's something I was able to bring from this experience of learning another language. And I was able to bring it into like my psyche and who I am. And I am now an assertive person. It's sometimes tricky, but I thank German for that.
I never really thought about it in terms of behaviors that a language might support you in. So like you said, German supporting you in being assertive. I'm learning Spanish at the moment, and Spanish has definitely taught me to be assertive as well. Like they're very assertive, but they're also quite like fun, and like they're very friendly. Like they'll always say hello, how are you, how's your day, etc., like the Irish. But then I was kind of reflecting there and I was thinking, what kind of characteristics has speaking Irish maybe given me? And I'm suppose what came to my mind straight away was, of course, the idea of storytelling. Irish is such like a lyrical, like descriptive language. I mean, evident in, as we said, the kind of place names, or like names of like around mythology. Like they're so descriptive in what they say. It could be one word, it could be two words, but it gives you so much information. And I think that really lends to us as a people and our ability to be incredible storytellers. Just even the sentence structure of Irish, it makes like your story is just kind of like almost more elaborate, a little bit more of a fun pace or a rhythm to it or something like that. What is it about Irish and it's like syntax and structure that makes us into storytellers? Oh, and that's what we are, and we have been for thousands of years, you know?
And I think that's the whole, it's a very holistic thing, right? Like the language is linked with the land, is linked with our psyche, is linked with our mythology, etc., etc. Like it all kind of builds on itself. But then we have a history of being storytellers. Like the Celts were storytellers, and it's how they kept their history alive was through storytelling. Because of course it's much easier to keep a history alive if you tell it as a story or as a poem or as a song, because we're great lyricists as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, it would be a fun thing to explore. I want to ask you a couple more questions before we wrap up. So
Yeah.
one of them I want to ask you about is maybe if you'd any thoughts on how we today as Irish people could connect more back to our ancestors and their traditions. Is there any kind of things that we can do in our daily lives, or kind of, I don't know, I suppose traditions that we can like incorporate into our habits or routines?
I kind of harken back to the episode that you released recently with Rob, and you were talking about, and I was the whole episode just kind of like, yeah, so true. You were talking about how a lot of us kind of don't really have time for things anymore. And Emma DeBeer, she talks about this as well, right? Being time poor. I suppose this doesn't really answer the question specifically, but like on a systemic level, I think we need to move more towards a more natural rhythm and flow in how we work and how we balance our lives. And I think it actually, it kind of brings me back to the very start of this interview. Coming out of this haze of COVID did a lot for us in that sense. It drastically challenged how we see things and how we see the world. And I think we need to keep driving forward with that. Personally, my next thing is the 4-day work week. I talk about it all the time. I think that's the next frontier. I think that's really where we need to get to.
It's funny that you You mentioned the 4-day work week because that's my full-time job.
Is it?
I promote the 4-day work week.
Oh, I probably follow you on, as in like before this.
Yeah, you probably follow like the company page or the organization page or whatever. Yeah.
I'm real.
Super pro 4-day work week. I work a 4-day week. It's allowed me to be able to do this podcast. It's definitely obviously gaining traction and stuff at the moment, but like, yeah, like this whole idea of like work and life being like so intertwined and like life being work is just, it's a new concept.
It is.
And we as people are not developed for
not
it.
Meant
like
to do it.
No, it's not natural at all. We need to be connected to the land.
Yeah.
Like our ancestors. We need to be more creative. I actually have a guest coming on who's going to talk loads about kind of creativity and as a healing method and poetry and storytelling, you know, and mental health and all of that. So I'm really excited for that because I think that's an important part of Irish culture as well. I want to wrap up with like the question that I ask everybody, Emilie. So I'm curious, what does it mean to be Irish?
I think for me, it's gra. There's that kind of direct translation of gra being love, right? But there's so much more to it than that. There's a kind of feeling, a deep feeling with that word. And I think it's something that, I mean, it might not be accurate to say we're the only people that do this, but it feels very easy to connect with another Irish person. And I don't think that's just because we come from the same place. I think there's something a little bit deeper than that. You know, my boyfriend is English actually, but you know he wouldn't have that same kind of experience. This is a very kind of simple but very relatable example. I was over in Paris last week. I was visiting my friend. She lives over there. And we got off the plane and we were chatting about, oh, will we get, you know, the metro back to her place or would we get a taxi? And this woman came up to us, a Dublin woman, Nuala was her name. And she said, girls, can I just interrupt you? Ye seem to know what you're doing. I don't know where I'm going. I'm meeting my friend here and I'm nervous and it was nighttime, etc. And we were like, I should just hop in the taxi with us. Like, oh, it is no bother, like hop in. And I don't know if that's a transferable experience. It's also something I felt, so I did, because I studied German, I did an Erasmus over there. And I love Germany, love the German language, love the people. And they're very nice people and, you know, I've some great German friends. But coming back to Ireland, even the moment you land in the airport in Ireland, there's that gra, and it's from strangers, it's from people you know. There's a warmth, I suppose. I think that's what I would say.
I love what you said there about coming into the airport. This is so embarrassing, but like whenever I go up to like the passport control, I give them, I actually start, like, I feel a tear in my eye. I don't know why that is, but I'm just like getting ready to go Gorm Mahagat, you know, and just be like, I'm Irish, I'm from Ireland, I know my language, I'm home.
Oh, it's so
like,
true.
It's such a special thing. Or like even when you're in the airport and you're waiting at your gate in the foreign country that you're in and you're heading to somewhere in Ireland, so naturally there's a load of Irish people sitting around the gate waiting, you know, for boarding. If it's Ryanair, they're going to be standing for 30 minutes regardless. Anyways, that's another story. So, and you just hear like a Cork accent or something like that. And you're like, perfect. And I know you were talking earlier about like the idea of the archaeologist, how he figured out like Celtic people were their own people. Like our Irish people are different to British people. Like, and that was like a very unique thing to have discovered. I saw this thing recently and it was like, you know, the concept of the big Irish head. Have you heard of that before? When someone says, oh, they have a big Irish head.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So there was like, because it's kind of a saying, you I live in Spain, so like, oh my God, me and my girlfriend can always tell if there's an Irish person walking towards us, and we were like, sure, the big Irish head. And basically they're after,
oh, don't you?
You do know, you do know, if it's not the white skin and the freckles and the burn and, you know, the GAA jersey, but like other than all of those things, you know, but they've done a study and they've realized that Irish people actually do have larger heads than everyone else. So there's truth in the phrase "big Irish head."
Oh my God, that's hilarious. And actually, that goes back, and this is probably an awful note to end on, but to the BBC documentary that Father Dougal presents called Tomb Raider. This guy, Adolf Marr, he was a proponent of this idea as well, that eugenics, like there was at the time like measuring of people's heads and, you know, is this person more intelligent, etc. So that happened in Ireland as well. So it's interesting that
is interesting. It kind of ties it all back into to what you were talking about beforehand. Thank you so much, Emilie, for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I have learned so much, and I'm sure everyone else has learned so much too. And best of luck. So you have got a book club at the moment.
Yes.
Amazing.
Yes. So that's actually, and thank you for mentioning it, and thank you again so much for having me, because this has been great. But yeah, I have when my TikTok videos started, you know, blowing up, so to speak, I thought, well, you know, I'm learning a lot about this stuff, and I'm still very much, like I mentioned, on this kind of learning journey. So yeah, I started a book club. It's on my Substack, which will be linked, I suppose, somewhere here. So yeah, we're kind of exploring at the moment, old ways, old secrets, and we'll just kind of keep going. Thank you very much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, and I'm so excited to see like how you grow on TikTok and Substack and the book club. It's just absolutely fantastic. There's clearly if you look at your comment section, like people are like, oh my God, I love
engaged.
This. Yeah, they just absolutely love it. So I'm so excited to put this out there and spread the Irish mythology and all the good things with that.
Great.
So thank you. Gorm míle maith agat.
Thank you.